First of all, thank you, Bea, for that important and moving set of comments and challenges. It's been a pleasure to participate in the enriching discussions of this conference as a newcomer. And there's been a lot of thought, a lot of food for thought, and what I'm going to say will, I think, touch on themes that have been raised already to some extent. As we know, suicide prevention has moved up the policy agenda in recent years. An intensely feared topic has appeared on the lips of the Prime Minister. If we want to know how suicide is understood, however, within the broad field of suicide prevention, we have to pay attention to a range of different voices. One of these is those personally affected by suicide, as we've just heard movingly from Bea. Voices that are driving and critiquing policy. I speak to you as someone bereaved by suicide, who's involved in different ways in the apparatus of suicide prevention. Above all, I offer a reflection on meaning and ethics, on how suicide is understood and narrated as moral sense-making in ruptured lives, and how this relates to practice. At some point, and it might as well be at the outset, I have to tell you that I'm here because in 2010, my 23-year-old son killed himself. He was, like many young men who die by suicide, a brilliant, loving young man who just gained a first-class degree, an undergraduate degree, and was involved in postgraduate study, and who not long before had lost his mother to a slow death from cancer, along with other socially mediated losses, and who suffered a rapidly deepening serious depressive illness, which was poorly diagnosed. My impulse is to tell you more, much more, now that you know that I'm a father whose son was one for whom life was not worth living. Indeed, I need to tell you more because the loss of my son is a moral tragedy that requires moral sense-making. However, in this kind of gathering, I have something different to do, and that's to reflect on the kind of narrative that this would be, what it would do, and how it's relevant to the work of suicide prevention. First of all, let me make a distinction, helped by the anthropologist Cheryl Mattingly, between third-person and first-person perspectives. Both the science of suicide, suicide prevention, suicidology, and its postmodern critique involve a third-person perspective. Knowledge in the first person, in contrast to these, does not start with categories themselves or take these as a unit of analysis or deconstruction. It's instead grounded in my capacity for experiencing the world. I don't anyway experience myself ontologically merely as a member of a category. The question is how I inhabit subject positions given to me. And reality presents itself to me as something out there only through my engagement with it. But the dimensions of the first-person perspective that I want to emphasize here is the ethical one. Not the Kantian moral rule, but the reflective and evaluative capacity of human life. That is virtue ethics, which owes more to later Foucault's interest in freedom and techniques of reflective self-formation or subjectivation than power and discipline. Foucault's concept of subjectivation no doubt helps us understand the pre-suicide state of mind, but my focus is on post-suicide, on suicide as moral tragedy for survivors, including myself, and how the first-person ethical work of recovery produces knowledge and engagement in suicide prevention. At the centre of this is a paradox. Many engaged in suicide prevention, those willingly complicit in an apparatus premised on claims about the governability of life, the management of risk, evidence-based interventions to save life, and plans for suicide not to happen, are precisely those who know from personal tragedy that risk cannot be managed, that signs do not warn, and that we are not in control of the things that matter most. I and hundreds of other survivors of suicide loss sit with experts and bring to the table our full awareness of existential vulnerability, knowledge that life is unstable, chaotic, and cruel. which perhaps in itself is, as Arthur Kleinman puts it, a kind of quiet liberation, preparing for new ways of being ourselves, living in the world, and making a difference in the lives of others. I'll argue that this presence requires the field of suicide prevention, at least now and in the UK, to be a space open to awkward juxtapositions, different knowledges and experiences and realities. In the same building that I chair the quarterly meetings of a North London Authority suicide prevention group, an interagency planning body that brings together the local authority, health commissioners, the Mental Health Trust, the police, housing, Department of Work and Pension, Charities for the Homeless, Samaritan's Mind, and many others, and which is mandated by the National Suicide Prevention Strategy, and whose work is shaped by Public Health England guidelines on suicide prevention. In that same building, each month I co-lead a peer support group for those bereaved by suicide. The two are clearly different but intimately linked in ways that challenge settled understandings of suicide prevention or simple interventions and give urgency to action. This is where I'm heading in this talk, but I've two questions on the way. One is, how does experience of suicide bereavement, produce engagement? And I have in mind what the anthropologist Michael Jackson argues is an existential imperative to convert givenness into choice and live the world as if it were our own, that is, to respond to suicide. But first, I want to ask, what kind of knowledge comes from first-person perspectives through ethical work on the self? And I'll talk about three things here. First, responsibility. Second, agency. And third, narrative. Responsibility. Let me speak personally. In the immediate aftermath of the death of my son, I had no means to make sense of what happened. I was overcome by a pain that was emotional and physical, an assault on the mind and the body that brought close the end of things, the end of my world and the end of me. Like many I know who faced this grief, I experienced a shadow of the pain that made my son think of oblivion. I was bound up in his death because I didn't experience myself as entirely separate from him. I was, and indeed psychically remained part of me. Part of me died. At the same time, I was aware from my dreams of emergency rooms, resuscitation, repeatedly negotiating with a part-living, about-to-die figure, that the psychic registering of the death of my son was accomplished only slowly. This mutuality of being involved in any relationship, intensified in the case of a parent-child, implies responsibility for the other. Suicide involves the experience of what is called agent regret, in which people take responsibility for something over which they had no control. Of the many spinning wheels that come to be aligned to produce a tragic death by suicide, or the long causal chain, we home in on the ethically relevant segment that shouts, "I could have done something," which Webb Keane refers to as hyper-hermeneutics. The meticulous and painstaking search for the causes, reasons and intentions, ending with an identification of the self as cause. The point is, the first-person moral responsibility is determined not by the way responsibility is distributed in cultural, institutional, or even in analytical terms, but by relational closeness. Agency. Bound to the problem of responsibility is the question of the personhood and agency of those who've died. We don't only grieve the person lost, but also the manner in which they died, their suicide, which presents a second loss. Those who kill themselves aren't just lost in the sense of dead, they're profoundly unreachable, no longer knowable. When my son killed himself, at first I couldn't ask for reasons. Reason itself had run headlong into one last long tunnel without exit, as Simon Critchley puts it. He'd become another creature driven by unknown forces or drumbeats. His in his place were a host of semi-detachable agents and determinants acting upon him and beyond his control. Serotonin metabolism in his brain, deep psychosis, the unseen work of genetics, unresolved grief for his dead mother, depression, perfectionism, impulsivity, and any other unknown figure or mad agent of death that inexplicably took control of this normally intelligible and highly intelligent young man. I was suddenly in a world of alien agents and distributed agency. Suicide ruptures what we might take to be the Western idea of personhood and agency. And there's little to distinguish my conviction that some agent or alien aspect of himself had taken control of my son's mind from the ideas of spirit possession of the Tamil villagers I've lived with in South India. The person after suicide is radically different from the person before. But while my son threatened to be lost to me in the fragmentation that a search for explanation brings, this exteriorization of causes allows us to retain the coherence of the person and our relationship of love, and offers moral protection from blame. Narrative. The preservation of self from the anxiety of self-blame, and the preservation of the other, those loved in our relationship with them, through exteriorizing agency, are two sides of the same coin, elements in the building of a sense-making narrative, with which to carry on living after such a death. But of course, the account doesn't settle there. Agency and rationality and choice are repeatedly returned to my son in a painful, reflective cycle, as other determinant factors and circumstances come and go. The truth is, I'll never know what led my beloved son to kill himself. And I can't here pull together the parts of my own narrative for you. But I can say something about the necessity, the context, and the process of narrativizing suicide and the ethical work involved. Every suicide is a tragedy. This is true, but when I reflect on my experience, I'd say rather that every suicide becomes a tragedy. It only gradually acquires a narrative and meaning. To begin with, there's no narrative or meaning, not even language, just an animal howl. Finding a way to narrativize the death of my child by his own hand is a requirement of living with that awful fact, rebuilding a ruptured biographical narrative and recovering my place in society. Even if you think nothing has changed, for me everything has. The time before Jake's death is another continent. Time and space are profoundly refigured. Suicide isn't just loss, it's ethical injury. Almost universally, suicide is shaming and staining of the moral identities of those who died and those who survive. It's destruction of the morally self-defining role of parent or of sibling or son, daughter, wife, husband or partner or others. Without question, suicide in our society remains something unspeakable. If stigma means anything here, it's that the anxiety that suicide provokes, the preemptive explanations, the judgments it attracts, affect social interactions as people draw invisible lines between their ordinary selves and lives and suicide. Some of this is in the mind of the bereaved, but society has placed it there. It may take years, decades, perhaps a lifetime before a parent can say to someone in an ordinary walk of life without anxiety, born of uncertain appraisal, my son killed himself, or my mother, or my sister, my husband, as if this were a tragic accident or a fatal illness. Suicide is a death unlike any other because it's a death with a different relationship to the living. This is coded in cultural and historical practice. We may not plunge a stake through the heart of the body of the suicide or pile heavy stones atop the grave to stop the spirit rising, but those grieving such a death, in other terms, still recognize that such a terrible act would come back and infect the living. In South India, such a traumatic event is understood not only as an ordeal of the interior emotions, it also produces new creatures in the world. These creatures have a horrifying agency and ontological characteristics of their own as spirits and demons. Loss to suicide requires ethical self-remaking. We need stories as survival tools, making sense of the past so as to allow investment in the future. These serve as self-defining myths, mythic in the work they do, not their lack of truthfulness, that allow my or our own moral accountability as a father, a son, sister, husband, and that protects the moral standing of those who've been acquired by the loaded label suicide that so often signals mental or social defect. But this ethical work of living with loss to suicide isn't carried out alone. It's interactive and social. Whether through families, friends, counselling or peer support groups, recasting an individual tragedy as a collective one, making social connections born of the kinship of grief, is necessary and de-isolating. In the peer support group that I co-lead in North London, people build their sense-making narratives of suicide by lending and borrowing fragments of each other's stories. We come to see a pattern and realise that ours is not a singularity, but a kind of experience. In a survivors group, my individual, subjective and fragmentary experience, perhaps a trauma that has no words, acquires language and social recognition. We find witnesses to our tragedy and speak as representatives of the dead, saying what they cannot. And through the experience of compassion for others, whose experience I share, I learn to be kinder to myself and blame myself less. Once people bereaved have the social experience of a shared narrative and think of themselves as a community of grief, crossing the widest social divides of class, race, sexuality and religion, they're more able to think of suicide in social terms, or to conceive of the death as a consequence of the failing of institutions and wider structures of society. I asked not only why my son died, but why was he not stopped from killing himself? Was everything done that could have been done to give this young man and others the chance to find a solution to their problems that didn't involve death? Beyond the almost unscalable mount of parental responsibility lies a field of institutional responsibility. Every death produces a distinctive catalogue. The failure of depression treatment in primary care, poor monitoring of risk-prone antidepressants, the flaws of crisis care, risk management, an accident in emergency for the suicidal, the absence of non-medical supportive environments in which to talk about the desire to die in people's own terms, and more. The failings of the healthcare are added to the failures of social care, of employers, the benefit system, support for care leavers, housing agencies evicting tenants, student services, payday lenders fueling debt crisis. Of course, blame in its various forms located outside the family also serves the psychological function of displacing anger and guilt. Awakened to suicide in society, some who are bereaved raise voices against the lack of awareness of suicide and how to talk about it in our society, or the cultural framing of male distress that places help beyond reach for men for whom walking through a door marked mental health is not in their repertoire of what to do in a crisis. Sooner or later, responsibility expands to society at large. I discover new facts and new causes. What was initially a private trauma appears as a national statistic. I learned that after the financial crash, suicide rose, and that the middle-aged men in the most deprived areas had the highest suicide rates, associated with a host of socio-economically induced losses that we've talked about quite a bit here at this conference. As our narratives open a widened field of responsibility, we also begin to shift from what explains suicide to what suicide explains. Suicide is attributed a kind of diagnostic quality for social ills that Ludek, China and others indicate, with which comes its political force, speaking to the conditions of the victims of poverty, discrimination and other things. These are actually our stories, connecting our tragedies to others. We are engaged. So let me turn finally, the last 5 minutes, I hope, to engagement with suicidology and activism. That, as it were, existential imperative to turn givenness into choice, that is, to respond to suicide. Relational closeness to suicide engenders a faithfulness to the tragic event for which we hold deep regret. Suicide becomes a close and permanent presence. For some, this brings unresolved grief, post-traumatic stress, and a world forever full of impending disaster. At worst, it brings suicide. For others, knowing the worst that can happen changes the scale of what is important, de-individualizing our tragedy, and taking what threatens to deplete the self into a project of ethical self-making by means of engagement in the world of suicide prevention. This will to act is often born out of a conviction that those we've lost may not have wanted to live now and in this circumstance, but did not intend to die. Desired the end of intolerable emotional pain, the recovery of self, perhaps unification with another, but not the end of everything. Ambivalence about dying gives opportunities to build on the wish for life, and engaging with this hope has for many, including myself, been a way to give meaning to a loss that threatens to be unbearable. The unalterability of personal tragedy draws us to a world that promises alterability through suicide prevention planning. Some of us enter the very systems that failed us in order to bring alertness and change from the perspective of how wrong things can go. For instance, participating in review of crisis resolution or psychiatric liaison. We retrace and overwrite the pathways to tragedy. The family whose son killed himself after poor treatment in A&E establishes a non-clinical crisis centre for emergency referrals. The family who lost a student son to suicide focuses on school and university well-being. Another mobilises a post-vention service. These are living memorials. Where my public health directorate could or would not do so, I stepped in with a local charity Mind to establish the interagency group now leading suicide prevention in a North London borough. As an outsider acting within systems of healthcare and suicide prevention, I can be a heterodox presence, juxtaposing person to protocol, subjectivity to system. Simultaneous identification and distanciation brings an orientation which is ethnographic. I'm committed to bringing such reflective and experiential knowledge into the apparatus of suicide prevention. And this can be done locally and collaboratively through the sort of suicide prevention group I work with, whose work on suicide focuses attention on glaring social inequality, isolation, discrimination, the vulnerability of migrants and asylum seekers, the homeless, the alcohol dependent, the various dangerous and toxic spaces in our local community, and discovers patterns, circumstances, and modes of intervention that are locally relevant. Suicide re-engages my sense of citizenship. Its fundamental issue of humanity opens doors, crosses boundaries, upsets hierarchies, and draws people across the widest stretch of our society because concern about suicide is pervasive, and because suicide is a powerful, serious, emotionally engaging matter. The networks that it produces have a special affective quality. Those affected by suicide also have an influence on national strategy and guidelines, reminding us that policy, while self-represented as driven by evidence, is actually as or more responsive to experience and ethics. I was going to say something about the national networks and alliances and their impact, but I think time doesn't permit that. So perhaps let me just say that these networks are critical and challenging as well as diverse. And that in my experience, the world of suicide prevention in the UK certainly questions the idea that the authority to tell the truth about suicide is in the hands of a narrow medically dominated group. And it's no longer, or less and less true to say that suicide is treated in a highly medicalised and individualised matter, especially since it became a public health matter, to be addressed at the community and societal level, which is why local authority public health teams are supposed to take the lead. The forms and access to support, and the in and beyond, well beyond the healthcare system, needs to change, and that's widely recognised. The impact of this perspective on practice in a cash-strapped NHS and deficit-managing local authorities reliant on charities whose funding they've axed is a moot point. Above all, as I constantly have to remind those in the health service I engage with, as we develop the various public or mental health, social care or youth support and crisis interventions to try to prevent suicide, we should never forget the profoundness of suicide and the real existential crisis of those who are suicidal. If suicide has become a matter of statistics to monitor, risks to tick box assess, or to manage through protocols, or a pathology to treat, or a problem to pass on, if we lose sight of the irreducibly human crisis of people who are suicidal, the cry of pain that needs a human response, our institutions will never provide the safety we aspire to. And sometimes we, those affected by suicide, just need to come together silently to bear witness to the fact of suicide and all that it means. To this end, in the last 3 years, I've organised a special non-religious service of reflection for those affected by suicide at St Martin in the Fields in Trafalgar Square, to which some 500 people have come each year. A time together with music and words from the bereaved and those attempt survivors, and a space for reflection for those living with loss and grief and journeying towards hope and healing. Thanks.